In this video, we're going to be talking about the Guides tool here inside Pixel Creator Pro. It's one of the functions that I'm most proud of and most useful when we're doing our album layouts. And once you understand all the available options for guides, I think you'll find that we're going to use that function quite a bit. So the Guides tool here in Pixel Creator Pro has lots of options that, and you may say, well, it's not really necessary, but again, I think you'll find that there's a lot of opportunity to use guidelines when you're doing your album layouts. Now, we actually have kind of two sets of guides. One down here where we have guides, and then we have the B, R, and C, and I'll explain what those functions are. And then up here we have the quick guides. Now, they kind of go hand in hand to some degree. So let's just begin by showing you some basic functionality with guides. So we have a basic document open. When I click on guides, I want to create some guides. So I'm just going to add a margin of 0.5, and you can see where it says IN. Because my units in my document is currently set to inches, it's going to assume I want to use inches when I'm typing in a numerical value here. And up at the top, notice it says document. So what we're saying is we want to add guidelines based on the current document. So when I hit process, it creates a series of guidelines exactly a ½ inch around the perimeter of the current document that I have open. When I hit C, means C for clear. R is reset default guidelines. Because when we're doing album design, we typically are working on a double page spread. And so what R does is kind of sets our guidelines back to their default setting, which is a 1/4 inch perimeter guideline, a guideline showing you where the center point of the spread is, and vertical and horizontal guidelines showing you the dead center of the left, dead center of the right. That's a typical album design setup. So that's why we have that function right there. So again, we'll hit C for clear. Now B stands for border. Because it's a function we use a lot, or at least I do in album design, where I want to create guidelines around the border of something. Sometimes if I have a selection and hit B for border, then it's going to create a series of guidelines around the selection that I have currently selected. If I have, for example, an image opening and I hit B for border, then it's going to create a series of guidelines around that image opening based on the layer mask. Now, if I don't have a layer mask, I'm going to hit C for clear, and I hit B for border, then it's going to add guidelines based on the content of the layer. And the last option, of course, is what if I have a shape layer and I hit B for border? Well, then it's going to add guidelines based on the size of my shape layer. And if I have none of the options and I hit B for border, then it adds guidelines around the border of my current document. Now you say, well, what if those aren't enough options? What if I had a situation where I had more than one layer and I had some crazy reason for needing guidelines around the entire border of all 3 layers? If I have more than one layer selected and I hit for B for border, we get an option. Do I want to add guidelines to individual layers? So my first option will be no. What we get is a series of guidelines around the border of the 3 layers that I had selected collectively. Could be useful in certain circumstances. Or if I hit B for border, I say yes, then it would add a series of guidelines around the border of each of the layers that I had currently selected, which again, in certain circumstances, that could actually be quite useful. So you wouldn't think that you have so many options when it comes to the Guides tool, but that's some of the basic options that we have available to us. So let's go ahead and go back to guides. You can see here, these are pretty straightforward, these little tick boxes. If I wanted to add a guideline to the center vertical of the layout, I could choose that, center horizontal, and process. And you can see I get a guideline. Pretty straightforward. I hit guides again. If I needed a guideline just on the left or just on the right, I have that option too. So we hit process, and now we have a guideline just on the left and just on the right. Another option that's kind of fun here in margin, or really any field, if I needed to add a series of guidelines, I could add 1/8 of an inch and had a comma and 1/4 of an inch. And so when I hit process, you can see I get 2 sets of guidelines around the perimeter of my document, one at 1/8 and one at 1/4. And if that wasn't enough, what if I needed to do something really crazy, like I needed to add guidelines -1/2 inch and +1/2 inch based on the current document. I hit process. You can see now I have a series of guidelines, 1/2 inch to the inside of the document and 1/2 inch to the outside of the document. Why you would ever need guidelines to the outside of a document, I have no idea. But there are certain circumstances where they actually can be kind of cool. Now I could, for example, make a selection, and I'm going to choose guides. And because I have a selection present, it's assuming that whatever guidelines I add, I want to add to the selection. So in this case, it might actually be useful to add a -0.5 dimension and a +1/4 dimension for some unknown reason. Who knows? But I hit process, and you can see what I have. I still have my current selection, but now I have a series of guidelines to the outside of my selection by 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch to the inside of my current selection. Likewise, if I were to have some type of object, so for example, I have a shape, and I choose guides. Same thing, if I add a -0.5, it's going to be and a 1/4 inch to the inside. And notice it says to add guidelines based on the current mask or content, and I hit process. Now I have a series of guidelines, 1/4 or a 1/2 inch to the outside edge of my shape and a 1/4 inch to the inside of my shape. So lots of very useful options there. So earlier when we were talking about our custom shapes here, what if I wanted to drag out a rectangle, and then I click on guides, and for a margin I want to do 3/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to hold down my Alt key or Option key on a Mac. Using those guides, I can cut a hole in my shape. You see there? And I'm going to go into my custom shape tool here, and let's go ahead and change this to on the line floral 2, and I'm going to add a little design element to the bottom of this shape, which I just did. Let's go ahead and do that again. Click on my vector layer mask and add that design element again. So I'm adding it to my existing shape, and now you can see what I have here. I have this nice little frame. It's all one piece, and if I didn't have that guideline tool, I wouldn't be able to make this frame exactly 3/8 of an inch around the outside edge. So it actually can, there's lots of different purposes for adding guidelines. I'll go ahead and click on guides again. We've kind of exhausted all the options with margin. If we skip down here to detailed, I could add guidelines from the left edge. So for example, if I needed a guideline at 1 inch and a guideline at 3.375 inches from the left edge of my document, I just add a comma between and hit process, and you can see I get a guideline 1 inch and 3 3/8 inch from the left edge. And again, when we're doing ad layouts or something like that, that can actually be very useful. Now, what if I click on guides? Remember I said here it defaults to inches because my current document value is set to inches. If I were to come in from the left edge 200 pixels, so I type in pixels to overwrite the inches, now I get a guideline exactly 200 pixels in from the left edge. So if we're doing web layouts or something like that, where a certain dimension would be nice to have. That is an option. We can override the default unit values. Now, if I change the unit values to pixels and I open up guides, it's going to change and assume that I want to, whatever numerical value I enter is going to be entered in pixels because that's the current unit value of the document. So if I wanted to type in a margin of a 1/2 inch, I just type in IN and I can overwrite the default pixels and I still get a guideline exactly a 1/2 inch to the inside edge. So lots of different options there. I'll go ahead and go back and click on guides again. Now we do have the option up here. I don't use it very often, but I just threw it in there because in certain circumstances it may be useful to set up a series of guidelines and reuse those. So we've given you the option to save different presets for guideline setups. So under user defined here, you can choose a custom preset, and you can create categories and so forth as options as well. So that might actually be quite useful to be able to save your own custom presets for guideline setups. Now, we didn't talk yet about gutter, but we have a gutter option where we can do a vertical and horizontal gutter, which can be useful in certain circumstances. So let's do 0.25. The key thing to keep in mind when we're doing a gutter is that whatever dimension that we enter, no matter how we enter it, it's always going to be double what we enter. So I entered in 1/4 inch and I checked the vertical and horizontal option. So when I hit process, actually I'm going to clear that out and we'll do that again because it assumed I wanted to use pixels. Well, you can't do 1/4 pixel. So let's do 1/4 inch IN and hit process. What I actually have is I have 2 sets of guidelines running across the vertical center, 1/4 inch to either side of vertical and 1/4 inch to either side of horizontal. So if I click on guides again and only did, for example, vertical and type in 0.25 inches, then I would get 2 sets of guidelines, 1/4 inch either side of dead center. So again, certain circumstances that can actually be quite useful. Now, talk about quick guides. There's lots of instances where we want to quickly add a guideline. So we're going to go ahead and choose add aperture here. We just have an image opening. If I want to quickly add a guide to the left edge, to the right edge, to the top, to the bottom, to vertical center of the currently selected layer, horizontal center, you have all those options where we can quickly add guidelines. Likewise, we can also do the same thing for selection. So if I have a selection present and we want to add a guideline to the bottom, boom, there's a guideline to the bottom. So let me show you a fun little practical example of how we can utilize guidelines to create a layout, and also how we can utilize quick guides. Why did we invent these tools, and how would they have a practical application when we're doing our layouts? Well, let me show you. So I have a 10 by 20 document. I click on guides. We are going to come in from the margin 1 inch. So we have 1 inch. I'm then going to make a selection. And I'm going to choose add aperture. That creates one large image opening. I'm then going to change my rectangular marquee tool to a fixed size, 0.25. Oops. See, I have to switch to inches. So when I enter my width and height values, it assumes 0.25. And the height, we're going to do 60 inches. And I'm just going to click on my document and start deleting. Delete, delete, delete. And I'm just kind of randomly deleting. There's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing. And then I'm going to flip-flop the dimensions and do the exact same thing horizontally. Okay. So now I'm going to grab my magic wand tool, and I'm just going to click on one of these squares. Now this is where quick guides comes in. I'm going to add a quick guide to the bottom and right side edge of the current selection. I'm going to click in this upper corner and I'm going to free transform and snap to that new guideline that I just created. I'm going to click on another square, do a quick guide to the right, and then I'm going to select this square and free transform and scale it over to snap to that edge. We'll do a quick guide to the right for this square. Same thing, right up here, free transform, snap it right to the edge. And I think you can kind of see what we're creating slowly but surely. We'll do a quick guide to the right, and we'll go ahead and transform that square. And we're going to transform this square. And then here, we're going to actually do a quick guide to the left. And we're going to take this bottom square and stretch it up to the top edge. So we have one large image opening. And then finally, let's go ahead and do a quick guide to the bottom. And take this square and free transform it. Take this square and free transform it. And do a quick guide to the bottom again. And free transform this square. Okay, and go ahead and hit C for clear. Clear out our guides. So now we have this kind of nice little collage layout. Now, what we have is a problem where we have each one of these image openings in our collage are all on one layer. And so that's why we created this little magic button here next to Add Aperture called Break Apart. So I click on that button. And all that happens is Pixel Creator Pro will take each one of those different areas of the layout and put each one on its own separate image layer. And that's really all it does. And once it's done that, now we can populate each one of these layers individually with images. So that is a practical example of how you can use the various guideline tools here in Pixel Creator Pro when you're doing your album layouts. And of course, there's a million options in different ways that we can utilize the guideline tools, but that just gives you one practical example of how we can utilize those guideline tools to aid us in our album design. And it's so much simpler using those guideline tools than the very rudimentary guideline tools that are offered to us here inside Photoshop.